Russia's Civil War 1918 to 1921. Strengths of the Reds and weaknesses of the Whites. The Civil War can be divided up into the strengths of the Reds and weaknesses of the Whites. These can be divided up into 5 different sections: their aims, their geographical factors, their leadership, their support, and their use of propaganda. Aims and divisions. Reds. The Bolsheviks had one uniting aim: to stay in power. This made the Reds a more focused fighting force. Aims and divisions. Whites. The Whites were made of different groups and not one uniting aim. They could not agree on whether they were fighting for monarchism, republicanism, or for the Constituent Assembly. This made it hard for them to cooperate and impossible to develop a coherent strategy. Their only united aim was to defeat the Bolsheviks, but this was not a strong aim. Geographical factors. Reds. The Bolsheviks had the central areas such as Moscow and Petrograd. They moved their capital to Moscow as it had the center of the railway network. This made moving men and munitions to the front easier. These areas also contained armament factories and a lot of men. This meant that the Bolsheviks would be able to conscript large numbers to fights. The Red usually vastly outnumbered the White armies. Geographical factors. Whites. The Whites were scattered and separated by large distances. This made communications very difficult, especially moving men and weapons and coordinating attacks on different White armies. They had no telephone links and had to communicate by officers on horseback. This was very slow and unreliable. The Whites struggled to coordinate attacks. Leadership. Reds. Lenin. Lenin made key decisions such as closing down the Constituent Assembly because he knew the Bolsheviks would not do well, and reduced the rights of other political parties. Lenin signed the Treaty of Brest-Litovsk, which brought Russia out of World War I, but Russia lost a lot of land, resources, and population, but Lenin had no choice. This allowed the Reds to focus on winning the Civil War. Lenin brought in the introduction of war communism, which seized food from the peasants and supplies from industry was given to the army. Lenin supported the use of Red Terror via the Cheka, which was suppressed opposition. The Cheka shot 8,000 people in 1918, taking action against the SRs and the Mensheviks. The Cheka also executed the Tsar and his family in 1918, which deprived a unifying aim of the Whites. Lenin supported Trotsky's decision to restore the hierarchical structures in the army, which brought back generals and commanders, but also introduced discipline. Lenin knew that this action was necessary, even though it was not communist. This action was not popular among the soldiers, as they thought the army would become equal. Leadership. Reds. Trotsky. Trotsky gave the Bolsheviks a single, unified command structure, which allowed him to transform the Red Army into an effective fighting force. Trotsky was able to inspire and rally his men. He had a special train which brought him to the front line to support his men, but also bring fresh food and new supplies. He organized the Red Army and used 40,000 ex-Tsarist officers, as he recognized their experience in war. He wanted them to bring discipline and training, but the officers had no choice, as their families would be killed if they showed any disloyalty or didn't cooperate. They even had a political commissar to watch over them constantly. Discipline was tough, as Trotsky brought back the death penalty, and he used it frequently. If peasants retreated, they would have been killed by loyal soldiers behind them, which were on the same side as Trotsky appointed. Trotsky also promoted people and ability, which meant peasants could become officers. This showed his loyalty and how fair he was with the hierarchical system. Trotsky realized the importance of holding Petrograd against an attack from the White forces. Lenin had wanted to abandon the defense of Petrograd, but Trotsky knew that, as Petrograd being the home of the revolution, it had symbolic importance. The Reds eventually forced the Whites back and held on to Petrograd. This was very moralizing for the Reds. Leadership. Whites. The Whites weren't unified and were incapable of developing an effective military strategy. The White generals would not work together. Some generals were suspicious of Kolchak's motives and intentions. White leaders were second-rate and treated their men with contempt. This didn't inspire loyalty. These were because many leaders were incompetent and were from higher classes. The generals reminded their troops of the worst aspects of the Russian army and Tsarist rule, which led to thousands of deserting. This was high in discipline and corruption in the White armies. Denkin said, "I can do nothing with my army. I am glad when it carries out my combat orders." This showed how they had lost control. The generals usually sold their uniforms and foreign supplies on the black market and spent their time in brothels in a haze of cocaine and vodka. Support. The peasants made up the main body of both armies, but the peasants did not like either side. Lenin had legitimized the right to land, whilst the whites made it clear that they would give the land back to the landowners. The peasants were more off for the Reds. Support. Reds. The Bolsheviks' support of the peasantry was vital. While the peasants did not like either side, the Bolsheviks' land decree had legitimized their right to the land, which made the Bolsheviks the lesser of two evils. The Bolshevik decree on nationalities 1918 offered hope to national minorities that they would have greater freedom under Bolshevik rule. They did not have a widespread support among the urban working classes, but the urban workers considered the Bolsheviks as the better alternative to the whites. Anyone who made gains between February 1917 and October 1917 wanted to protect their gains, and the Bolsheviks seemed to offer this protection. Support. Whites. The whites made it clear that the land that the peasants seized would be returned back to the previous landowners. There was a dramatic drop in white peasant support. They also made it clear to the national minorities that they wanted to restore the Russian Empire to pre-1917 borders, with the slogan, "Russia one and indivisible." This antagonized national groups such as the Ukrainians and the Georgians, who were looking for greater independence. The whites had little support from the urban workers, as they had little to offer them. Anyone who made gains between February 1917 and October 1917 wanted to protect their gains, so they stayed away from any sort of white support. Propaganda. Reds. The Bolsheviks saw the value of propaganda. They used imaginative and powerful images, such as the "Be on Guard" poster by Dmitry Moore in 1921, which showed a heroic Bolshevik guard defeating the invading whites. The Bolsheviks were able to present the whites as being in the pay of foreign enemies and present themselves as the defenders of Russian soil against foreign invaders. The Bolsheviks used multiple slogans in their propaganda, such as "Whites would take land from the peasants," and "Foreign invaders were supporting the whites," and "Reds offered a wonderful new society for workers and peasants." Being able to defend Petrograd from the whites when Lenin wanted to abandon the city was a big propaganda success for the Bolsheviks, as they were able to keep Petrograd and force the whites back. Propaganda. Whites. The whites, especially Denkin, failed to see the value of propaganda. Foreign intervention should have worked in the whites' favour, but turned out to be a big propaganda failure. The support from the foreign powers was half-hearted and ineffective, and their support dried up after 1919. The whites were presented by the Bolsheviks as working with foreign enemies.